Stories help us make sense and meaning out of our individual and collective experiences. From a psychological standpoint, story making is crucial to achieving personal change. Neurologists have illustrated how hearing the stories of others promotes the empathic response between individuals, lending credence to the old adage that the shortest distance between two people is a story.
Y'all, we are here today for the Active Collective Trauma Summit. This has been 2 years of more than 100 organizations coming together and saying, we must address this, and we must address this right now. I was up last night. I had insomnia. I feel like I threw a personal party today. I want you to know that. I feel like this was created specifically for Candice Bailey. For those of you who don't know me, I should probably introduce myself. I am Candice Bailey. I am your MC extraordinaire, Ms. Mouth. We're ready. So this morning, we're gonna get into some things. And I had a trigger alert shirt. They said I just need to wear that all the time. And so I'm going to give you a trigger alert because today we're going to trigger you. We're going to trigger you with the thought of healing as a group. What that means is we have been harmed as a group, and yet we think that individually we will go away and fix all of our problems. And if we do not come together, we will not heal our active, collective trauma. We always hear something about historical trauma, and today we are here to dispel that. Systems of oppression have evolved. We must evolve as well. We cannot use yesterday's tactics and think it will solve tomorrow's issues. You're going to see our community coming in strong. I'm looking around this room. I feel like I really did throw a personal party. I feel like I invited all of my best friends to come and heal with me. And so this is such a phenomenal moment. I was thinking about what the theme of today would be, and we talked about this very in depth in our committee. We talked about educating everyone about what active collective trauma actually is, and how are we navigating that individually, as a group, as the healers. My grandmother used to often say, when things are going wrong, you find the helpers. And everyone in this room is a helper, is a healer, is a light carrier. After 2 long years of coming together as a collective unit, we knew that we could not sit still idly any longer and that we must take action. Today is about that action coming to fruition. Bringing each and every one of you into this space is so important. Because when you leave here with a new light, a new hope, and a new connectivity within our community that will allow us all to start digging into the trauma that we are experiencing as a collective. Next, we're going to have 2 ladies come up because we are going to do a land acknowledgement. We have Mandy and Melissa who are going to be doing our land acknowledgement this morning. And they did this so last minute for me. So I really want to give them a shout out and say thank you.
Thank you. Before we can talk about healing our collective trauma, we must acknowledge that the land on which we learn, teach, live, and grow is the traditional and unceded territory of the Ute peoples. We, the descendants of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and the 48 other tribes that inhabited that we know today as Colorado, pay our respect to elders past, present, and future, and to those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations.
We acknowledge also that academic institutions were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples, This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning, continuing the process of working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and recognize the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Ometeo.
Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you. Thank you. As we begin today, we must always acknowledge the land that we are on, because if you're on stolen land, I think you must talk about it a little bit. So next up, we have Miss Wendy Talley from the Latino Coalition coming up to do our Change Makers speech.
Good morning. Take a look around. These are the people you've been waiting for. These are the people that are going to cause our collective healing. So don't forget that. So I don't know what a change maker speech is supposed to be about, but I'm going to tell you a couple of things. My name is Wendy Talley. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership. Yes. That black and brown thing happening together. But I thought about when I was asked, like, what does a change maker speech look like? I thought about I can only talk to you from my heart and the practices that I have instituted to live the life I'm living. So I want to share them with you. And so that you can see yourselves as I see you, as the not even change makers, y'all are transformation makers. Because I don't want things just to get a little bit better. I want stuff to transform. I don't want things to get a little bit better, because change implies a little bit better. What I want to have happen in the world that I live in is transformation. So y'all are transformation makers. So one of the things I want to share with y'all is you have to start considering the context of life from what's possible, not from what's predictable. You know, the predictable life, if you look at our past, and that says, oh, my life's going to turn out a particular way because of that past. I want you to consider, as a transformation maker, that you have to consider living from what's possible. And what's possible is our collective healing. Can I hear that again? What's possible is our collective healing, and that we're collectively accountable for that healing. Can I get an amen? Or ashe? Or whatever you say in your tradition? Because I come from a Baptist tradition, and now I practice Ifa, so I'll get whatever name I want. But if you give me some ashe and some amen, let me know that you're hearing what I'm saying. So first thing, as a transformation agent, you live from what's possible. Now, living from what's possible, does that mean you see it? No, it's unseen. It's never been done before. Don't be looking for some pattern of the past to give you the future. You are going to make this up. I have a life made up from the choices. So my predictable future would have been something totally different. But this is the future that I've created. So living from what's possible. All right, you got that part? All right, next part. And I don't got my glasses on. Lord have mercy. All right. The other thing I want to say about possibility is the possibility of collective accountability. There's an opportunity that we all have, and that is to come together and harness our collective power. No longer is it going to work for us to move as individuals. We must work as a collective and be accountable to each other for our healing of our community and the quality of life for our children and their children and their children. All right? Now, next, once you live your life for what's possible, then you got to set an intention. Anybody who knows or plays with me, I usually set an intention. You have to consider, what is my intention? What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to make happen? What is my intention? My intention today was just to share with you from my heart. Here's what I've been doing. Now, I'm almost the big 6-0. I'm almost the big 6-0. So I've been on the planet for a couple of minutes. And I want you to consider that I'm just sharing with you the things that I've been practicing that have been effective at being a transformation agent. So 1, living for what's possible. 2, setting an intention. 3, commitment. How many of you make a commitment every beginning of the year? Raise your hand. Every beginning of the year, you make a commitment. Raise your hand proud. You make a commitment. All right. Then what happens around February? Human beings, consider human beings. Sometimes we don't live from what we're committed to. We live because circumstances come up. Somebody made me mad. Somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do. And then our commitment is out the window. What I want you to consider to be a transformation agent is you must live with your commitment at the forefront. Not that it gets put on the shelf when things get a little tough. All these organizations, I see all these signs, those are people who said, I'm going to live my commitment rather than the circumstances. Because if we look around the world right now and we're looking to that for our guidance, I think we might be in a little bit of trouble. What are you committed to? And stay the course. I can't believe I'm still reading without glasses. All right. So you got your possibility, you got your intention, you got your commitment, and now I need you to take an action. How many of y'all talk about change? Raise your hand. And then how many times do we get stopped to take action? We get stopped to take action. What I want you to consider is if you take actions aligned with your commitment, aligned with your intention, aligned for what's possible, a world that you cannot see right now, manifestation will occur. I promise you, manifestation will occur. In 2017, I started looking at who was being served by crime victim services in the state of Colorado. I started looking at what money was going into that process, what the landscape looked like. And we found out that folks who were people of color, men and young adults, were the most likely to experience being a victim of crime and the least likely to get support. So I took an action. I took an action where I said, that has to change. What does it look like for us to invest in community efforts to heal our community? So take an action. Now, how many of you brush your teeth? Yeah, everybody should be raising their hand. So if you think about action being a practice, all right? So you brush your teeth, it's a practice. The only reason I get to be here and do this work, I've been a social worker for over 34 years. I know, ain't that something? I started when I was 12. But the only reason I'm still here, the only reason is because I cultivated these practices. Yoga, Satya Yoga, I was in Satya Yoga. I went to the teacher's learning thing, not because I wanted to be a yoga instructor, but because I knew if I paid money that I'd go do yoga. But what I learned in yoga was nothing exists without a practice. So if you don't practice doing something for the healing of yourself, for the healing of your community every day, those little efforts are what's going to make that collective thing happen. So really want you to consider practice. She didn't give me the line yet. No, she didn't do it. Okay. Then I want you to consider what's next is you got to reflect. If you don't reflect, what if your stuff ain't working? What if the things you're doing aren't working? If you don't pause, so I really want us as activists and as community folks, as healers, to really consider it's important for us to reflect and pause. So, gosh, I was trying to fund some community partners and realized they didn't have the startup money. Everybody don't have $25,000 in their back pocket to hire a staff person to do all their work. So if we as funders want to make sure that folks can do the work, we might have to give them upfront money. But if I didn't stop and reflect that something wasn't working, then I wouldn't have been able to cause a new practice. So I really want you to consider, as transformation agents, all the way in the back, I want y'all to consider that taking time to reflect is important. The next thing is realign. Realign your possibility, making sure your possibility and your intention and your actions are all in alignment. So the thing that most thrills me in life is when my actions, my possibility all line up, y'all. And then someone comes up to me and says, hey, I really got what you said. So that means like I'm living in my full alignment. So you want to be, as a transformation agent, living in alignment. And it all starts from your side of the sidewalk, not outside. We're all focused on what's happening outside, but this change and transformation I want to consider is with you. Start with you. And then find some people in the room who you can do this work with. And then she's giving me the number. All right. One thing I want to share with you is after that, you have to remember that we are one. So I would like everybody, please stand. What side is this? Is this right? Is this my right hand? Okay, my right hand, your right hand, it might look different. Your right hand up, and then I want you to all have the heartbeat. This is what connects us as transformation agents. One heart, standing for our community. Ashe, Ashe. Thank you so much.
All right, Miss Wendy Talley. Next up, we're going to have our keynote speaker. Today's keynote speaker is a really good friend of mine. His name is Jason Vitello. And Jason and I have been friends for quite some time. When I was getting ready to do the introduction for Jason, I thought, what would I say? And then he sent me this bio. So for those of you who don't know Jason, he has the best sense of humor. So I'm going to read his bio. I never read anything, so this is very off chart for me. Jason Vitello is the president of the Colorado Public Health Association, a practitioner at Public Health Institute at Denver, and an adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. He is also a speaker, a consultant, educator, and activist committed to the advancement of justice, equity, and healing in our communities and in the systems that serve them. Formerly, Jason was a social worker and therapist who provided advocacy and clinical services to individuals from over-impacted and under-resourced communities. It should be noted that before he was ever a provider of human services or family assistance, he was the recipient of them. His ultimate interest is in collective liberation and the betterment of the human condition through fierce compassion, unity across struggles, the peaceful obliteration of structural inequalities, and comprehensive paradigm transformation. And if none of this works, he will likely return to being my bartender. So without further ado, Mr. Jason Vitello.
Good morning, Grand Rising. My friend Marissa just told me she never wants to go to another conference if it does not have a DJ. Right on, I agree. Man, I need you in my life, just in general. Welcome. Welcome to day one of the first ever Active Collective Trauma Summit. It is a tremendous honor and privilege to be standing here before you today on behalf of our planning committee to provide some opening remarks that will hopefully frame the origins, context, and purpose of this convening. I've essentially been tasked with telling the story of how and why this came to be. As Candice just read, I do wear quite a few hats. I perform in quite a few different roles, but my favorite, which isn't even listed in that bio, would have to be storyteller. That is because I believe in the transformational power of narrative. I always have. As mentioned before this phase of my career, I spent some time as a therapist. By the way, I'm probably a much better therapist now that I no longer see patients. I still practice on my friends and family, they don't know it. But when I did, my favorite theoretical orientation was strengths-based, solutions-focused narrative therapy, which upholds that storytelling is an exercise in meaning making, which is integral to healing from trauma. It also asserts that the individual is the expert of their own life and the author of their own story. And while they might not have a say in how their story began, they do have a say in how it ends. I also strongly believe what our ancient ancestors held to be true, that those who are good at telling the stories no longer have to carry the water. I'm tired of carrying all this water. So here we go. Once upon a time, about 2 years ago, my friend and colleague Nakshan Zohari from the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment called me up to discuss the possibility of a training, maybe an afternoon training, that would address the effects of historical trauma upon individuals from over-impacted and under-resourced communities. Now, usually when we conceptualize trauma, we tend to think about people who experienced an overwhelming or life-changing occurrence or injury in their past that has had profound impacts upon their physiological, psychological, and social development or well-being. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, requires a criterion aversive event in one's past or childhood for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Maybe it's an overstatement, but I've heard it said, and I appreciate the sentiment, that if we were honest about trauma and all the ways that it shows up in people's lives, the DSM would be a pamphlet. And for far too many people, their criterion traumatic event in childhood is their childhood. And this convening would be for them. But the more Nakshan and I talked, the more we realized that the last thing this needed to be was a platform for academics or public health, healthcare, or other systems professionals to talk at community about their trauma or to tell them how to heal from it, but rather a platform for community and its healers, helpers, champions, and change makers to tell their own story and to inform and educate the systems professionals, the funders, the policy makers, and legislators about trauma, healing, and the path forward. So we reached out to community leaders across Denver Metro to establish a planning and advisory council to assist us toward that end. You'll see their names on the promotional materials and many of their faces throughout the day. While many amazing organizations and communities are represented, we understand that many are not. Please consider this an open invitation. We hope participation at the table that informs subsequent events continues to expand. So initially we planned for a one-day event, a historical trauma conference. Over time, and it wasn't gonna have a DJ. That's right. Over time, the planning and advisory committee engaged in some very intentional dialogue. We had some fiery conversations, which would ultimately alter our entire course. An initial sticking point was the concept of historical trauma itself, as Candice pointed out. The idea being that this qualifier of historical might imply that the traumas that certain individuals, communities, and societies disproportionately experience are the result of events that happened long ago in our past that may have no bearing upon our present condition. We wanted to avoid any possible inference that racism or other oppressions are aberrational relics of our nation's past, but are rather active, with sustained insidious effects across generations and communities. See, for many with PTSD, there's nothing post about it. Their trauma is present, persistent, and pervasive. We landed upon active collective trauma and defined it as follows. Multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. It is related to events such as genocide, homicide, enslavement, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. For many groups, this trauma actively continues today in the form of enduring, endemic, and systemic racism, which is typified by practices such as redlining, gentrification, hate crimes, denial of oppression, victim blaming by the dominant group, and police brutality. These practices are driven by the legacy and continued influence of white supremacy, leading to a situation where all parties live inside a system that creates collective trauma for us all. We also determined that the last thing we want to do is trigger or re-traumatize our participants or host a forum that illuminates trauma without also bringing to light a path forward toward restoration, reconciliation, and healing. We quickly understood that achieving this would be a process and not an event. So a one-day conference has become a 3-day summit with a DJ. We hope that this will continue on an annual basis until it is no longer necessary. Our ultimate aim with these convenings is to cultivate and compile solutions that will inform funding, policy, and programming decisions in Denver and Colorado and beyond. And not just from the presenters and the panelists, the people on the stage, but all of you, the experts of your own lives and communities. We further hope that this summer will create meaningful opportunities to act, to take action, which addresses both the symptoms and the systems of trauma and help facilitate personal, interpersonal, and societal healing. Hence our name, ACT ACT. And that's our story. I want to acknowledge that ours is part of a much bigger narrative and a much bigger movement. Many of you are aware of the comprehensive story of systemic oppression and racial trauma in Colorado, starting with the arrival of European American settlers who stole the land from Native Americans and Latinos, and then treated them as outcasts and foreigners. Discrimination, violence, and exclusion against African Americans, Asians, Italians, Jews, and others who brought linguistic, cultural, or religious diversity to the state was commonplace and comprehensive. In the 1920s, Colorado was a KKK stronghold, and Denver was its capital. Mayor Ben Stapleton swore his allegiance to the Klan and filled city government and the police department with other members. Entire communities would and still experience the traumas of aggressive policing, systemic neglect, under-resourcing, divestment, and other manifestations of inequality and oppression. Thankfully, that's not how the story ends, as the Mile High City has been a standard bearer and a front runner in the fight for social justice and civil rights for over 100 years. Since the 1860s, we have seen Black and brown movements such as the Congress on Racial Equity, or CORE, the Crusade for Justice, the Denver chapter of the Black Panther Party and the Chicano movement, and multiracial and multicultural coalitions lead marches, protests, sit-ins, and other campaigns to demand voting rights, equal access and treatment in public accommodations, police accountability, and the integration of schools, businesses, and housing. We have also seen and still see active community-driven movements out of neighborhoods like Park Hill and Five Points, once called the Harlem of the West, to reduce violence and victimization and promote health, healing, safety, justice, and liberation. Many of you sitting in this room still carry the mantle and can trace your lineage to these powerful leaders to whom we owe so much. Leaders like Jerry Grimes, rest in power. Or Corky Gonzalez, who in 1968 led the Southwest contingent of the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., alongside Dr. King. This was part of an expansive and yet to be realized national vision of unity across struggles, with poor whites, Native Americans, Black and brown people and their accomplices marching through the streets of American cities and our nation's capital for economic justice, political empowerment, and collective liberation and healing. See, Denver's story is part of a much bigger narrative as well. Last summer, I went to Washington, D.C. myself. I'm a third-generation veteran and the child of an immigrant. I grew up in a patriotic household. I've been to our nation's capital many times, but as I laid eyes upon the monuments and the memorials this time around, I did so with a newfound sense of the majesty and the fragility of everything that we have built. At the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, I reflected upon a quotation inscribed in marble: "Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in." There's a lot there, but it was the word struggle that struck me most. Every gain ever made in the United States, which has advanced equal rights for disenfranchised groups, including racial minorities, women, LGBTQ plus individuals, the poor, or people with disabilities, has been fiercely resisted and has only ever come through struggle. Calls for the abolition of slavery, demands for workers' rights, voting rights, civil rights, human rights, reproductive rights, whether manifested in ghost dances, moral pleas, organized protests, boycott sit-ins, peaceful marches, civil disobedience, the silent taking of a knee, or the throwing of a brick through a window in desperation and despair, have always been met by a vitriolic response of rage, hateful rhetoric, or outright violence from a large sector of our society who are resolved to keep things exactly as they are. There have always been people who are more incensed by resistance to injustice than they are by injustice. I was reminded that day in DC that the story of the United States is not the story of freedom, but of the paradox between freedom and oppression. It's not the story of democracy, but of the traumatic and sometimes violent tension between democratic and anti-democratic forces. The story, the full story, is in the struggle. The struggle between individuals who see America's greatness in our rear view and those who see our true greatness upon the horizon. And the struggle continues. In the past 2 years alone, the US has seen disproportionately high rates of COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths within the BIPOC community. High-profile murders of unarmed Black people by police, a rise in discrimination and hate crimes against individuals of Asian descent, the reemergence of overt bigotry in public and political discourse. In response, the American Public Health Association and many of its affiliates, including CPHA, public health departments across the country, have declared racism a public health crisis. That was the right thing to do and the only thing to do, but I would like to acknowledge that racism has always been a public health crisis. We've also seen an increase in the public will to more vigilantly attend to racial inequities. Take a closer look at our over-reliance on law enforcement when it comes to addressing homelessness, mental illness, substance misuse and addiction, and violence and victimization in BIPOC and other communities impacted by concentrated poverty. Unfortunately, significant backlash and counter efforts have arisen as well. We've seen a proliferation of anti-public health movements, of hateful rhetoric across corporate and social media platforms, gerrymandering of districts, legislation in multiple states which diminishes the voting power of racial minorities. We've seen the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court, which will result in higher rates of death and poverty for all women, but especially our Black, brown, and Native American sisters. In the midst of what could rightfully still be called our post-pandemic desolation, we are witnessing an unfortunate but unsurprising rise in crime and violence here in Denver, across the country, and across all demographics, which has also given rise to an old and particularly insidious narrative, the regurgitation of the get tough, war on crime rhetoric, the falsehood that the only response to community violence is state violence. The best way to treat trauma, more trauma. Even our nation's narrative is contested. We've seen over 30 states pass laws which bans the teaching of factual history in schools. Legislation which restricts how your story and our story gets to be told. Ever feel like we're going around in circles? I don't know if we're going down a drain or ascending a spiral. I think that's up to us. But luckily, that's not how the story ends. Not if Colorado has something to say about it. Many of you out there are behavioral health professionals and healers. You understand the impacts of trauma upon an individual, that it can fundamentally and radically alter their very worldview, can impede their ability to form healthy relationships, especially with the other. It can overwhelm coping abilities, flooding the nervous system, and putting one in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. Left untreated, trauma can define one's very identity. Ours is a traumatized country. Our identity is still hanging in the balance. We're traumatized, we're in denial, and we are in deep need of healing. And healing only begins when we stop imagining or hoping for a better past, and can instead commit ourselves to fully acknowledging that past, the good and the bad, learning from it, and building a better future through the often uncomfortable process of restoration and reconciliation. I alluded to the healing power of narrative in my opening. Stories help us make sense and meaning out of our individual and collective experiences. From a psychological standpoint, story making is crucial to achieving personal change. Neurologists have illustrated how hearing the stories of others promotes the empathic response between individuals, lending credence to the old adage that the shortest distance between two people is a story. In his book, The Four Pivots, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves, Dr. Sean A. Ginwright describes the Black gospel tradition of testifying, or telling the truth from the soul, which promotes personal and collective validation and healing within a congregation, or the provision of testimonial or testimony in the Chicano tradition, which provides a firsthand count of political or social injustice which would otherwise be hidden. And of course, the indigenous traditions of storytelling, which offer counter narratives about the past and hold power, sacred meaning that can inform and guide our future. At its best, an important aim, perhaps the most important aim of public health, unmute and amplify silenced voices to ensure that counter narratives are represented and heard within the dominant social and political discourse. In short, public health strives to change the narrative and change hearts and minds, and in turn change policy, ultimately changing the very lives and material conditions of real people. That's why we're here. To flip the script. Not just change, like Wendy said, but transform the whole damn paradigm. Find the right answers, yes, but to also start asking the right questions. Questions like, what happened to you? Instead of, what's wrong with you? We are here to challenge the falsehood. One is either a victim or a perpetrator of trauma. Most are both. Because hurt people hurt people. Because violence is cyclical and communicable like a disease and must be addressed not just through cops, courts, and cages. But through community-based public health solutions which center prevention and healing. Because healed people heal people. We are here to heal. We are here to move from collective trauma to collective healing. Healing from the individual, community, and societal symptoms of trauma. And we are here to smash the patterns and dismantle the systems that perpetuate trauma to begin with. That's where you come in. All of you. Helpers, healers, champions, change makers, systems, professionals, funders, and legislators. White people. White people. Native Americans, Black and brown people, are accomplices. We are the heirs and the inheritors of the struggle and successors to a powerful legacy. So raise your fists and lift up your voices. We are the authors of our own story, and we might not have a say in how that story began, but we do have a say in how it ends. Power to the people.
And I don't even know how to follow that. Like, he should be Mr. Mouthpiece, right? What is happening? So we got to pay a couple bills and we got to thank some people. I'm going to go through our list of sponsors because I want you to understand who is supporting you in being here for healing today. At our platinum level, which means the highest for those of us who don't know, we have Planned Parenthood, Aurora Wellness Community, Department of Health and Environment, Public Health for Public Safety, and the Latino Coalition. At the gold level, we have the Montbello Organizing Committee, who also sponsored the interpretation services that are here in the building. At the silver level, we have Community First Foundation and Upstream LLC. At the bronze level, we have Blazing Cloud Consulting, Groundwork Denver, Connect for Health Colorado, Random Gestures of Compassion, Satya Yoga Co-op, Mo Better Green, Colorado Access, Councilwoman Jamie Flores from District 3, the Center for Trauma and Resiliency. Community, we have Core Capacities, and we have In Kind by Light Carrier, Apprentice of Peace Youth Organization, who was kind enough to bring you the smoothie truck, the Donation Broker, and of course the Hangar at Stanley. This venue was actually donated to us for this event to happen today, and so we are beyond measurably compensated. Then I got to talk about the people around the space that are sitting here because they're really special to me. So we have in the back the Therapist of Color Collaboration. Please raise your hands, ladies. This group will actually be in breakout room 4 in the far corner for this morning's session. If you are triggered, if you're having a moment, if you need to go and download with someone, they are available and they are here specifically for you. Of course. We have the Peace and Humanity smoothie truck outside. That's the Apprentice of Peace smoothie truck. We are so honored to have them in this space to be providing a healthy start for our morning. We have Behavioral Health, Salud Mental Health, CREA Results, Confluence Media Center, and our youth. Gentlemen, please stand up and wave. This is very important. These 2 young men are here today. They are providing a live stream. We want our youth in this space, and we thought very intentionally around what that would look like. And we are so, so happy to have them here and so proud of what they are doing. We have the translation provided by the Community Language Cooperative. Raise your hand for our interpreters. We are so happy that they are here today, and in the following days of the summit, we will also have something for the hearing impaired. And last but not least, DJ K-Dot. Each and every organization that is in this space today has taken the time to come out and support each and every one of you in this journey into looking into active collective trauma. As we get ready to break out into breakout sessions, I want you to know that this is your space. This is a space where you are safe. This is a space where we are loving one another. I was thinking very distinctly about what would be happening in this space. And I thought about something very important. If it's not healing, it's not happening. In this space, we will live by that mantra. If it is not healing, it is not happening. And I want you to take that with you today, because if for some reason you find yourself in a space or a time that does not feel healing, I want you to sit with that. I want you to be mindful of that. I want you to exercise the healers that are in the room. Give them the opportunity to do what they are here for and lean in.
That was inspiring, dude. Wow.